Good evening. I want to explain tonight this paradox that the communists prefer Singapore still under British control but with the Internal Security Council abolished, rather than have a Singapore independent together with the rest of Malaya. The most important reason why the communists prefer a Singapore still under British control to independence is that with the British in control, their struggle for a communist Malaya can be camouflaged as an anti-colonial struggle. But if they continue their struggle in a Singapore which is already independent with the rest of Malaya, it is quite clearly a struggle not against colonialism, but against an independent elected government. Their object will then be obvious: to destroy an independent national government and to set up a communist government. Moreover, when they are dealt with by the government, as they have been from time to time, it is far better for them to have a British colonial government take action rather than an independent elected Malayan government. To be imprisoned by the British is to be a martyr in the company of Mr. Nehru, Dr. Nkrumah, Dr. Banda, and many other anti-colonial nationalist heroes. But to be locked up by Mr. Nehru, Dr. Nkrumah, or Colonel Nasser, or the Tunku, is an entirely different matter. Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, and the Tunku do not lock up nationalists, who are the real anti-colonialists. In fact, they welcome anti-colonial fighters who are nationalists into their ranks. It is only those who are out to destroy the independence won by the nationalists and who want to supplant it with a totalitarian or a communist government who are locked up by nationalist leaders like Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, and the Tunku. There is also this added consideration. If a communist is detained by the British, questions can be asked in the House of Commons in England, resolutions can be passed in anti-colonial conferences all over the world, and speeches can be made by friendly delegates in the United Nations. But if a communist is locked up by an independent nationalist government, there cannot be much noise or propaganda made out of it either here in Malaya, or in London, or in the United Nations, or in Belgrade and the other meeting places of the Afro-Asian nations. The Afro-Asian nations are not concerned with protecting communists. They are concerned with protecting nationalists. A man who is locked up by an independent nationalist government is not going to get the support of the Afro-Asian nations. The communists have therefore decided that a separate British-controlled Singapore under a democratic government elected in Singapore in sole charge of security is in their favor, because in such a situation they can build up their strength as anti-colonial forces, establish their base, and eventually liberate the Federation to their communist cause. They have seen during the 4 years since the Federation got its independence in August 1957, the steady decline of communist strength and organization in the Federation as they were dislocated, broken up, and pushed further and further into the jungle and over the Thai border. As they tried to penetrate the political parties and the trade unions and win influence and power in the Federation by stealthy methods of infiltration and penetration, the Federation government has from time to time smacked them down and purged them. Their room for expansion and growth in the Federation has been considerably limited. But in truth, the Communists prefer no merger and a separate Singapore. They want the Internal Security Council abolished in the separate Singapore so that there will be no overall control over Communist subversive activities. And then there can be greater expansion of Communist strength. Why did we accept the Internal Security Council? Its powers and its composition were agreed in the last constitutional talks in London in 1957. We accepted it because the decisive vote in the Internal Security Council is that of the Federation representative. We have not called for the abolition of the Internal Security Council because we believed the next step for us is independence through merger, and with merger, the Internal Security Council will automatically go. Until there is independence through merger, the Internal Security Council has to be accepted, not because we want to protect British interests in Singapore, but because we must agree to allow the Federation to protect itself from being undermined from Singapore. Those who call for the abolition of the Internal Security Council, in which the Federation and Singapore representatives jointly hold a majority vote, are those who do not believe in merger. If we agree to merger as the 12th state of the Federation, then surely we must agree that all the states in the Federation must control security matters for all Malaya, including Singapore. Let me recall what I said in October 1958 in the Legislative Assembly in the debate on the PPSO. It was nearly 3 years ago. I said, next year we are to be only internally self-governing, and in all security matters which affect defense, upon which the Singapore and British governments disagree, the Federation government is to be the arbiter. We accepted that position because we accepted merger as the only way to independence. If we are prepared to accept the Federation and join it as a member state, then it means that we are prepared to allow the government representing 11 states in the Federation to have a decisive voice in the affairs of Singapore. How can it be consistent to say that we want merger and at the same time object to the Federation representative having a decisive vote on the security position in Singapore through the Internal Security Council? If one agrees to merger, then one is agreeing to a pan-Malayan government having control over the security position in Singapore. But these are the contradictions and hypocrisies the Communists are led into in trying to conceal their true position as Communists. The Communists and their supporters tried both at the Hong Lim and Anson by-elections to make the people excited about the workings of the Internal Security Council. Lim Chin Siong and Fong Swee Suan made speeches in Hong Lim trying to show that the abolition of the Internal Security Council will solve all our problems. Unemployment, the need for economic development, housing, and all our social and economic problems will be solved if the Internal Security Council is abolished. So they argue. they talked of more democratic rights, by which they meant the rights of the communists to free and unfettered expansion. Both in Hong Lim and in Anson, they struck no responsive chords in the hearts of the people. What the people were discontented with was not the 30 communist activists who were still under detention because of the Internal Security Council. They were discontented because they had no jobs, no houses at low rents, because they had trouble in getting immigration permits for their relatives from China, from India, or they had difficulty in obtaining citizenship for their relatives already here. I ask you, how can the abolition of the Internal Security Council bring about economic expansion, stability, more jobs, more houses, more trade, and more prosperity? The communists always condemn colonialism for our economic and social backwardness. The abolition of the Internal Security Council will still leave Singapore a semi-colony. So how can the abolition of the ISC remove our economic and social backwardness when the root cause, that is colonialism, is still here? What the abolition of the Internal Security Council will definitely bring is more communist expansion, and with it, more unrest and political uncertainty. More unrest and uncertainty will mean less factories and less jobs. Less jobs will mean more unemployment, more discontent, which the communists can exploit. In the end, after a great deal of strife and trouble, the communists hope the British will give up Singapore, and an independent Singapore will be established from which they hope to be able to undermine and capture the Federation. But what is more likely to happen is that a great deal of strife will lead to riots and the suspension of the Constitution, and will bring economic chaos and suffering for the people. You will notice that the Barisan Socialist is the only party in the Legislative Assembly to have called for the abolition of the Internal Security Council. First, they repeated Lim Chin Siong's call for abolition of the Internal Security Council in 1963 in the constitutional talks. Then, at their meeting on the 17th of September, about 2 weeks ago, they called for its abolition immediately. If a communist front group, like the Barisan Socialists, could become the government, either by themselves or in a coalition, what are the consequences that will follow? What if Lord Selkirk really allows Lim Chin Siong and his friends to carry on if they play it constitutionally with the British, as Selkirk has led them to believe? Being what they are, just a front for the communists, they will increase their activities to undermine the Federation to the communist cause. They will do this by propaganda from here. But more important, as a government, they can extend massive aid to the communists in the Federation to bring the Federation down from within. There will be growing conflict and hostility between the two governments. Eventually, it will be the people of the two territories who will pay for all this trouble. When conflict starts, each side will use every weapon and every advantage it has against the other. It's no use being sentimental and saying that the Tunku will not be so inhuman as to shut off the water. Let's be realistic and understand that in a conflict between a hostile Singapore government and the Alliance Federation government, neither side will hesitate to use all its weapons to force the other to its knees. Water is only one of the decisive weapons. There are also economic sanctions which can be imposed on Singapore. 40% of Singapore's economy depends on imports and exports from the Federation. If the Federation is prepared to injure itself by importing and exporting at a higher cost through its own ports in Penang and Port Swettenham, then that 40% of our economic life could come to a grinding halt. This will cause mass unemployment and misery. Singapore will retaliate. Finally, the conflict will be resolved by one side asserting its will over the other by force. You will remember the immediate effect on our farmers' lives when the Federation early this year was about to impose a ban on pigs from Singapore and had already put a tax of 1 cent on every egg from Singapore going to the Federation. Again, several of our soap factories had to close when the Federation imposed a tax on soap from Singapore, until finally the Singapore government had to impose a counter tax to save our soap factories and the workers who were working in them from unemployment. Such economic conflicts could easily be increased 100 times. We have maintained the best of relations with the Federation in your interests, not in our personal interests. It is not sentimental friendship that determines our constant policy of cooperation for mutual benefit with the Federation government. It is the hard economic facts of life. If we allow these young and inexperienced open front workers of the Communists to have their way, abolish the Internal Security Council, and try to subvert the Federation from Singapore, a whole host of dangerous and unpleasant consequences will follow, for which not only they, but you, the workers, hawkers, farmers, businessmen, clerks, and other ordinary people will pay a heavy price. The danger of this conflict is very real. There are some young men in Singapore as determined and nearly as able as the Plen, who are all prepared to do these things. Let me read you what they have said in the latest university magazine called the University Tribune, September number 12th issue, which was published a few days ago under the title Merger as I See It by an anonymous Mr. Ma Chow Tong. He said, "Thus the right path towards a genuine unification of Malaya and Singapore is to launch a more determined and intensified anti-colonial struggle, which can be done by relying on the masses and its mobility, to strive for full self-determination, greater democratic rights and freedom, and demanding the total withdrawal of colonial control over our internal affairs, to expand the left-wing forces throughout the two countries and spread its influence among the people, especially the Malay peasantry. In short, to use Singapore as a base from which to undermine the Federation." In the Chinese original of this article, published in the Political Science magazine in June 1961, there are no words which said especially the Malay peasantry. Perhaps these words were added in the English version for the benefit of English-speaking Malay readers. The Tunku knows all about this, for he has an intelligence organization to keep him informed of all the changes in the Communist line and tactics of the Communist United Front. He has very definite views on this matter. In my first official discussions on merger with the Tunku on the 23rd of August, about a month ago, he made it clear that the Federation central government had to control security to ensure the safety of the whole Federation and the happiness and welfare of the people. He said that he had always wanted to do his best to help the people of Singapore prosper. Because of this, he had never blocked the causeway, but on the other hand, he had allowed free flow and movement of people and goods between Singapore and the Federation. But the Tunku said, if the communists in Singapore, in the unions and in the political parties, like Barisan Socialis, try to make trouble and upset things, it is bound to affect the peace of the Federation. Then, he said, he will have to go all out, to use all his forces and powers to counter them and to stop them from injuring the happiness and welfare of the people of the Federation. I feel you must know the Federation government's view of this. If Lim and his communist friends are allowed to upset things, it is not just they who will suffer, but also you and I, the people of Singapore. The rash statements and actions of the Open Front communist leaders are threatening our welfare and happiness. I know they are prepared to risk these troubles between us and the Federation. But should we allow them to do this when we have to pay for it? The real objective of the communists, now echoed and supported by Barisan Socialists, is obvious. What they want is to abolish the Internal Security Council in Singapore, and from here undermine the Federation. They are desperate and reckless enough to believe that they can do this and get away with it. You have to ask yourself whether you should allow these people to mess up our country's economy and our lives. You may ask, first, why did we work with these communists? And second, now that we know they are up to no good, why don't we take immediate steps to deal with them? I shall answer these two questions in my next talk.